So okay, terrific. Well, I can't show the video, but at least I can advance the slides. I'll just go along here. So the novel Harvest Home was published in 1973, the same year as The Wicker Man, and it was made into, should I say next slide? I'm not even sure what I should be, how we should punt here. Hello?
Yes, just say next slide.
Oh, okay, thank you so much. I'm sorry. So next slide. Great, thanks. It was published in 1973, the same year that The Wicker Man premiered. I'm going to just skip through some of this earlier information, but if anyone wants it later, you can have it. The novelist was a former actor, Tom Tryon. He didn't do that well in acting. He did one film, The Cardinal, which was well reviewed, and then he wanted to write screenplays, but he couldn't really get the money together, so he started turning them into novels. His first novel, The Other, was very successful, made into a made-for-television film in 1972. He then followed this up with Harvest Home. Next slide, please. And if you see these out in the wild, absolutely grab them. They are rather hard to find. You can see on the right there, that is the television tie-in. Next slide, please. This is an ad for the miniseries that was adapted and shown in 1978, 5 years after the publication of the novel. Miniseries were huge at that point in time. The previous year, the miniseries Roots was the most successful television event of all time at that time, and so television audiences were really into this idea of a film that sort of just went on over several nights. We now, of course, have what we call, it's extended miniseries, or how so much television works now. Next slide. More book covers. Next slide. Kindle edition. Next slide. Do not buy that truncated videotape on your left. That is a 90-minute version of what is actually a 4-hour text. The one on the right, you can get some bootlegs, and it is on YouTube. The quality is absolutely terrible. Next slide, please. Tom Tryon, the author, and next slide. Thank you. The miniseries adapted, quite successful, starring Betty Davis, who had already had the first of a series of strokes, but kept acting, which I think is fantastic. And she was mostly doing horror at that point in her career. It also cast David Aykroyd, who was in a very popular soap opera at the time. It was kind of a big thing for made-for-TV horror, sort of reinventing people. And then a very young Rosanna Arquette. Next slide. And then strangely enough, despite being published the same year that The Wicker Man was released, both narratives have numerous thematic and plot similarities, but neither the author Tom Tryon, nor Robin Hardy, nor Anthony Shaffer had any knowledge of each other. Next slide, please. And the basic plot, I can't really do this the whole thing here, but basically you have some outsiders from New York City go on a weekend getaway. They are having some trouble in the marriage. They have a sort of an, crabby teenage daughter. There are some difficulties at the time, which is 1973. We see that the family dynamics in America are sort of breaking down. We have the women's movement. Women want more out of life, et cetera, et cetera. The family is absolutely charmed by this small village, and they are able to buy a house for a very, very, very low price, unlike what's happening with real estate in the Northeast United States right now. And they meet the widow Fortune. They're charmed by her, and they decide to buy a home there and move away from New York City. Next slide, please. It's a picture of Ned and Beth. Next slide, please. And that's Rosanna Arquette as the teenage Kate asking a farmer she sees in the field, why don't you use machinery? And he says, goes against the ways. Next slide. And the ways, we have this the widow Fortune, played by Betty Davis, as a village matriarch. It sort of looks Amish, but it's way beyond Amish, because the religion is absolutely not Christian. It is very nature-based. They have a farming economy. They don't use motorized equipment, and they perform a series of agrarian festivals and events throughout the year, and this culminates starting in the spring and culminating in the autumn around Halloween. in a rite known as Harvest Home, and the village men are forbidden to attend Harvest Home. This is kind of a big thing. Ned becomes very curious about these rites, and he starts going to the library and talking to locals, trying to find out a little bit more about it. Next slide, please. And then we have the Widow Fortune. There's Betty Davis holding the corn. She is a healer. Everyone in the village defers to her. She's the only thing they have even closely resembling a doctor in the village. She presides over the festivals. And when Beth, who has asthma, has a really scary attack one day, the Widow Fortune just sort of cures her, basically just by talking to her and calming her down. She also gives Ned and Beth an aphrodisiac mead that rekindles their sex life, which has been fallow for some time. Next slide, please. So everyone in the village attends these rites that occur. They're open to the public, and they're very strange. When Ned's family arrives, they are there just in time for the choosing of the Harvest Lord. This is an event that happens every 7 years. There's a young child named Missy Penrose. She is mute, and she is the one who chooses the Harvest Lord. She puts her hands into the stomach of a slaughtered sheep and marks his face. And Worthy Pettinger is a young teenage boy who is chosen to attend this agricultural, or is chosen as the Harvest Lord. It does not really want to follow the ways any longer. He's interested in changing things up. He wants to start using machinery, and he's actually studying agriculture at a college in a nearby town, and secretly. So Worthy, after a few days, he actually rejects this honor. He knows a bit more about what's coming than Ned's family does. And he publicly denounces the widow, and he leaves the village. And his family, as a result, is shunned. And this is sort of in the Amish tradition of shunning, is shunned when they go to a festival offering their farm produce, everyone turns their backs on them because their son rejected that honor of being the Harvest Lord. Next slide, please. So when the new Harvest Lord is named, he chooses a corn maiden at Harvest Home. At the beginning of the film, Justin, who is the farmer that the family meets when they're driving around looking around, Justin and Sophie are married. It is sort of unusual for the two to be married, but Ned asks around. No one seems to understand why this is, that they shouldn't be married. They are given gifts and special treatment from the community. They're given help with their farm and all. And I don't have pictures of them because the quality is all so bad. But Justin and Sophie are just your typical beautiful white corn-fed, sort of Midwestern looking, absolutely strapping, gorgeous people. So there's this idea that you choose as the Harvest Lord and Corn Maiden, the best, the brightest, the most beautiful. Next slide, please. And that is Missy Penrose, the child who chooses the Harvest Lord. Next slide, please. Ned finds out that there is a history of disruption of this tradition. He learns that the previous Corn Maiden died. I'm sorry, this is an earlier version of my talk. I should fix that. Died mysteriously. A woman named Gracie Everdeen, a number of years ago, was the Corn Maiden to a man named Roger Penrose. At the very last minute, she was replaced by Tamar Penrose, who was Roger's wife. Supposedly, Gracie ran away after being dishonored in this way, but we know that Ned finds out her skeleton is hidden in a tree. And he learns that she had this horrible illness. It's basically a pituitary gland disorder that causes, called acromegaly, that causes you to suddenly, your hands and your feet and your skull to grow out of control and become very large. And she was disfigured. And so that is why she was not allowed to be the Corn Maiden anymore. The child conceived that year by Roger and Tamar is Missy, so she becomes this village oracle. And this is somewhat reminiscent of the character of Reuben in Midsommar, who is intentionally conceived via incest to also be an oracle for that village. Next slide, please. And that's Tamar Penrose. She's a very, very sexy lady. She is the village postmistress. Ned learns all the past Harvest Lords have died accidentally or otherwise mysteriously just after Harvest Home takes place, and that includes Tamara's husband, Roger. Next slide, please. Here we have another sexy postmistress, I suppose, Mother Mae Morrison, the mother of Rowan and the Wicker Man. We'll be talking a bit more about the Wicker Man very soon. Don't you worry. Next slide, please. So in this ancient rite of sacrifice, what we see in the playing out of these different events, the ritual cycle is a sort of elongated mystery play reenacting the rites of Eleusis. And these are all, as is recorded by Fraser in the Golden Bough, discussing all the different rituals of human sacrifice mostly throughout Europe. So this possibly inspired by Aleister Crowley's version of the rites of Eleusis. And we do know that Anthony Schaeffer and Robin Hardy drew very heavily from the Golden Bough when writing The Wicker Man. And we know that Sergeant Hoey is chosen to be this sacrificial figure. In Harvest Home, we also have in the cycle, at the same time that the Harvest Lord is sacrificed, they perform before he is dispatched. There is a ritual act of intercourse performed, and the aim is to impregnate the Corn Maiden. Now, in both of these stories, there is a hint of blight on the crops. So in Summer Isle, of course, there's no apples left anywhere, so they will have to do something about that. And Gracie Everdeen brings shame on the village, and this is believed that she also curses the land because of her disfigurement and lying about it and trying to hide it, and also bringing shame upon, the whole process of choosing a Corn Maiden. We also see later and in the present day Worthy Pettinger cursing the corn. He says, "God damn the corn and God damn the mother." And so obviously they need a sacrifice to occur to restore order and to propitiate the land, who is also the mother. Next slide, please. So the Eleusinian mysteries, of course, as you are probably all familiar, this is sort of the Demeter and Persephone myth. We see a lot of mother and daughter imagery in Harvest Home that corresponds to this mother-daughter pairing. We have Beth and Kate, the widow Fortune, who becomes a sort of mother-like figure to Beth, and then Tamar and Missy, a corn maiden who has given birth to the Oracle. And there's quite a bit of psychodrama around female relationships that does play out in the series. So, of course, these mysteries were kept secret, and the initiates who took part in them back in the day were sworn to secrecy, much as people are sworn to secrecy in Harvest Home. What no man may see, nor woman tell. In Harvest Home, we do hear women chanting Demeter and Mother and other words, other names of mother figures and goddesses in their ritual in the forest. And there is a symbolic union of the Harvest Lord with the Great Mother. That's sort of an overlay to the union of the Harvest Lord with the Corn Maiden. There's an etheric sort of union with the Great Mother during their active ritualized intercourse. And then corporally at the moment of death, he is literally joined with the land and the eternal return. Next slide, please. The culmination of harvest of the ritual cycle in Harvest Home takes place at night. All the other rites take place during the day. And so on the day of Harvest Home, the men are told to stay at home after a certain hour. It's like they sort of have a curfew and they're not supposed to go anywhere. But Ned decides he wants to find out what's going on. So in order to get to where they're performing the rite, he finds this underground tunnel that was used by a man who also lives in the village named Robert. Ned finds out that Robert was punished for being curious about the rites, and he is blind. He can no longer see. His eyes were removed, and Ned finds that out just before he decides to continue with his searching. You would think he would he would avoid it after he sees what happened to someone else who did the same thing, but he doesn't. He keeps going. So, and similar to the pits that are used for the Thesmophoria rites performed by women, there's this underground, pit that he has to go through, and he gets sort of filthy, and he comes up and at the forest clearing. Next slide, please. So I have to kind of rush through this because there's so a lot to get through here. Ned's wife becomes quite comfortable with life in Cornwall Coombe. It takes her a little while, but she starts going to quilting bees and etc. She spends more time with the widow. Kate takes part in one of the festivals, and one night when she's dancing rather suggestively, where Ned's been drinking corn liquor with the menfolk, Ned gets very upset seeing his daughter sort of sashaying around, and he acts out and, pulls her away and yells at her, and the villagers shun him after that. Ned also becomes a bit of a mentor to Worthy and encourages him to, follow his dreams and even leave the village. But his daughter Kate has a big crush on Worthy, and this makes things a little bit complicated in terms of Worthy making a clean break. As events transpire, later Sophie decides she does not want to be part of the final rites of Harvest Home, and so at the very last minute, Kate, Ned's wife, is chosen to be the Corn Maiden. And so basically we see that Ned sort of loses his family to the village's sort of feminine dominance. He basically has to surrender them to the ways. They are no longer under his control. They are now following the ways, following the words of the widow, and doing what she says. So they essentially become part of the matriarchy. Next slide. So there's a great emphasis on virginity and purity in The Wicker Man. As we've seen, it's really crucial that Sergeant Hoey is a virgin. I think that the longer version of the film actually supports this. We have his co-workers teasing him about being a virgin at the beginning, even though he's engaged, and they go to great lengths to try to seduce him. Willow McGregor tries, cannot do it, and so they know he's pure, and this is a big thing. But however, the virginity question in Harvest Home is more about Ned. Wanting to keep his daughter pure and safe, and he notices even though they're sort of have this Amish kind of a vibe. If you're familiar with Amish communities, sex is not a hang up that they have. They don't listen to music, but they don't have a problem with people having sex. So he does find that his daughter's sort of sexual awakening is happening within a context that he is not comfortable with. And this parallels the loss of Demeter's loss to Persephone in a way, to the underworld every season, to Hades, sort of surrendering her to this unknown pagan fate. But the concept of purity, sort of bodily purity, is more connected in Cornwall Coombe to this idea that someone cannot be chosen as Harvest Lord or Corn Maiden unless there is a certain perfection of body to them. And that is why Gracie Everdeen is rejected, and this becomes one of the most memorable sort of years of Harvest Home for everyone. It sort of lives on in infamy. And this is also found throughout the Golden Bough, this idea that the sacrifice chosen must be the best, the brightest, the worthiest, as in worthy Pedinger. Next slide, please. And of course, as I mentioned before, in this dramatic climax, there is an act of ritualized intercourse between the Harvest Lord and the Corn Maiden. The Harvest Lord is then sacrificed with a sickle. His blood spills on the earth, and then the women all basically fall on him, and they tear him apart with gardening tools like hoes and the forks, and if you're gardeners, you know what I mean, all these hand tools and rakes and shovels, and it's quite something. So in effect, the Harvest Lord is hoed and harrowed into the ground. His body is going to nourish the crops, propitiate the mother. And this is, of course, similar to the myths of Mithras, Christ, and other vegetation gods that are mentioned in the Golden Bough. Next slide, please. And there's also a lot of binary opposition in the visuals and sort of the thematic aspects of both of these texts. I would say we have day and night, light and dark, the sun and the moon, blindness and vision, speech and silence. Sorry, I'm kind of speeding over these. The Harvest Lord and the Corn Maiden are very gendered binary roles, and there's a very gendered and binary aspect to how men and women are portrayed, also in The Wicker Man, I think, as well as in Harvest Home. And there's this idea of freedom versus authority. The village of Cornwall Coombe has its own laws, and the Widow Fortune is the matriarchal leader. Next slide, please. We have some dual deity figures the Nuada, the god of the sun, and Avalanau, the goddess of the orchards in the Wicker Man, the Harvest Lord and the Corn Maiden in Harvest Home. There's a separation by gender in the schools and in the rites of May Day and at Harvest Home. Sovereignty and rulership versus an outsider. You have the Widow Fortune versus Ned and Lord Summerisle, the patriarch of his island, versus Sergeant Hoey, who's an interloper. Next slide, please. And I'd just like to read a little bit this is directly from the novel and also is in the film. This is Mary Fortune when she is speaking at the Harvest Home ritual. As it was in the olden times, so it has been and ever shall be. It is the way. The Spirit has been in our Lord for these 7 years, and he has brought us good harvests. It was the flesh of his body, his strength and his sinew, his limbs and brain, his blood that did this for us. The corn is his, each kernel, and for it we thank him. This is something to have done in a life. It is something to have been made for, to have been set upon the earth to cause the earth to bear. Hear me, for I speak with the tongue of the goddess who dwells in the earth. I remind you again of her promise. She will provide for us. She will give us the bountiful harvest if we, her servants, tend well to her business. Next slide, please. And then a little quotes from Miss Rose in The Wicker Man. You will undergo death and rebirth, resurrection, if you like. The rebirth, sadly, will not be yours, but that of our crops. And Lord Summerisle also says to Sergeant Hoey, right before the big conflagration that occurs, for believing what you do, we confer upon you a rare gift these days, a martyr's death. You will not only have life eternal, but you will sit with the saints among the elect. Next slide, please. And then more quotes about the mystery from Harvest Home. From his hand has come the gift, and in return we have shown him our secret. The soil has quickened and proved fertile, and the rains have been plenteous, and the sun of the world has shone on us. The corn grew, we have prospered. And in the gratitude of our hearts we now offer him the pledge and token of our esteem, as is customary upon the 7th year of Harvest Home, that he may know of us the secret heart of that which he himself has given us. He alone of all men may know the secret which has been given to us, the secret of the Sacred Mother. Next slide, please. And so then the widow holds up an ear of corn. This is just sort of the secret of it all, just before they slay him. This irrevocable connection of humankind to the land and propitiating the land in order to be able to eat and to live. And this is sort of similar, I think, to a scene which was actually cut from the film version for the most part, although that footage still lives somewhere. Apparently it's under the M1 the highway. That's a great story. Lord Summerisle does take Hoey on a tour of a cold cellar full of all these heirloom apple varieties, and they taste them all. Anyway, more quotes from Harvest Home. The whole vision, the life of the corn, the life of the men, inextricably bound together in oneness, bound in the tilling and the planting and the growing. Here in the grove, in this simple temple of the Mother Earth, the Harvest Lord is to be offered in ritual sacrifice. This was why they had revealed to him their mystery, because he would never live to tell what he had seen. Bound together in oneness, the Harvest Lord and the corn. And as the corn died and was reborn, so he would die and be born again, not in himself, but in the young Lord, the eternal return. So in other words, that same year that the Harvest Lord is killed, the young Lord takes his place and rules for 7 years, and then the cycle repeats again. Next slide, please. And of course, just to mention the context of this, the timing of their move to Cornwall Coombe and the timing of the writing of this novel, it does coincide with this sort of this cultural phenomenon happening at the time, the rise of the women's movement, goddess worship, neo-pagan witchcraft, and a renewed interest in matriarchal cultures in the fields of archaeology and anthropology. And so we also see that these two communities are havens for spiritual freedom. The residents reject the dominant monotheisms of the world, and they embrace nature worship. Next slide, please. Just a little bit about a sexual awakening. We do notice that Sergeant Hoey in the beginning of the Wicker Man film is teased for being old-fashioned and sexually repressed. And we see that Summerisle's unusually libertine customs awaken his sexuality as Willow tries to seduce him, and he sees sex in public places. And there is indecency in public places. And there's corruption of the young. Ned and Beth, as I mentioned before, they drink an aphrodisiac draft of mead, and they witness a strange sort of mystery play performance in the cornfield, sort of being pantomimed. And then their sex life is rekindled. It's sort of rather similar to Sergeant Hoey seeing couples making love on the village green. His first night there, and this aura of sexuality in both of these places is certainly tied with the residents' engagement with the natural world, especially the agricultural festivals, which are absolutely mystery plays about reproduction, right, and rebirth. And these two men, Ned and Sergeant Hoey, begin to understand their own sexual natures as they are influenced by this female-centered spirituality, even if they don't grasp their roles until it's too late. Next slide, please. Although they are given a chance to escape, but they don't listen, do they? No, they don't. They don't. Both men choose their own fate, and both are dispatched by the women. Next slide, please. And then I just have some comparative images. The sacred nature of trees and the connection of the dead. This, of course, is the cemetery in the Wicker Man, where everyone has their own little tree with a navel string. Next slide, please. Apologize for this terrible photo. This is an image of Gracie Everdene's skeleton in the tree overlooking the meadow where the harvest home rite is performed. Next slide, please. Beautiful shot from the Wicker Man, of course. The women meet in these sacred, beautiful natural areas. Next slide, please. And that, again, this is the meadow outside the forest is terrible quality, but this is women, these are dancing in a circle, clad in white, sort of like the Druids of the Victorian era with these torches. And then that's pictured down on the lower right is the women sort of falling upon the harvest lord at the culmination of the ritual. Next slide, please. And that is the only mention that this abomination of a film is going to have in this talk. I just think that's a really nice image of Ellen Burstyn as Sister Summerisle in the 2006 remake. Next slide, please. We have a procession to the sacred ritual site from the Wicker Man. Next slide, please. Terrible photo, I apologize. That they process with torches along a sacred rite to the forest through the village, through the town, along the sacred to our rights. A very, very similar sequence to the Wicker Man. Next slide, please. We also have the women washing the body of the condemned man. It's hard to see, but see that figure in the middle there. The women are washing the feet of Justin the Harvest Lord, who is blindfolded. Next slide, please. And then we have, of course, these beautiful women drying this Sergeant Hoey's face with their hair. Next slide. So just to finish up, oh, I'm sorry, slide before that. Oh, it's not here. I'm just gonna, that's Betty Davis. I'm just gonna read my last slide here, which is not in this version. Just to talk about the dramatic denouement of Harvest Home. After Ned is discovered watching the Harvest Home rite, he is invited to stay. The widow sees him and says, watch. He watches as the women all tear off Justin's clothes and caress him. He sees his wife, Kate, as the corn maiden and watches her engage in ritual sex with Justin. Justin's been drugged with herbs and wine. Then after that occurs, he sees all of the women fall upon Justin and tear him apart with the garden tools. And then we see the widow walking towards him, and it cuts to a scene where Kate and Beth are going off to a picnic with Jimmy Minerva, who's been chosen as the new Harvest Lord and is Kate's new boyfriend. And then we see Ned sitting in a chair listening to books on tape with sunglasses on. He's silent, doesn't say anything, so we understand that his eyes have been removed and his tongue has been cut out. What no man may see nor woman tell. And that is the end of my talk. Thank you so much.